a fisherman's taunt cut across the shingle. Rotting beach trash won't keep the snow off your grave.
They said the same about the old coastal thatch, and it outlasted 3 generations of milled shingles.
Ewan hauled the tangled kelp onto his cart without lifting his eyes to the jeering boats. By the time he reached the village lane, the cart reeked of salt and low tide. 2 farmhands spat and muttered, Mad McAllister and his rotten garden. A boy stuck out his tongue and shrieked, Your roof will stink worse than the fish guts. Margaret stood in the cottage doorway, her shawl drawn tight against more than the cold.
Ewan, the whole valley is calling you a fool. We can't even smell our own bed.
The smell will pass. The salt cures it. These stems are stronger than any milled board in town.
Margaret stared at the heap of dripping seaweed and saw tomorrow's ruin piled against her doorstep.
Ewan, that stench will seep into everything we own. And when it rots, the ceiling will fall on our children.
These stems were cured in salt and wind for months. They won't rot. Touch them yourself.
He snapped a thick strand, exposing the dry, fibrous core, and pressed it into her reluctant palm.
It's dry, but that doesn't mean it won't give way when the weight of winter comes pressing down.
Once it's laid, the loft will stay warmer than any sawn wood could manage.
Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but a heavy bootfall outside silenced her.
Who is that? Ewan? Did you hear those footsteps?
George Creswell filled the doorway, leather apron stained with pitch, his saw handle jutting from his belt.
I knew it. You've gone and piled that beach waste on your roof, haven't you?
Margaret's hand flew to her throat, and Ewan straightened, the room suddenly too small. George shoved past Ewan into the yard, his voice carrying to every henhouse and woodshed within earshot.
This is your roof. It looks like a drowned horse's mane. One wet snow, and it'll sag like a rotten sail.
It held through salt spray and autumn gales. It'll hold through winter.
Salt spray. You are not on the sea now. This valley gets 3 feet of wet snow that sits for weeks. Your seaweed will turn to sludge and pour through the ceiling.
Then I'll be the one cleaning it up, not you.
You hear that? He'll clean it up. After it's buried his family. I've sawn timber for 30 years, and I tell you, that roof is a coffin lid waiting to fall.
A murmur went through the gathering neighbors. Someone snickered.
If I back down now, they'll never let me forget it. And Margaret will always wonder if I would have let us freeze.
Ewan slung the seaweed bundle over his shoulder and climbed the ladder without a backward glance. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her face a mask of dread, as her husband's hands wove the first dark strands into the battens. For 3 days, Ewan wove in silence, and Margaret could not bear to watch. On the 3rd morning, a light rain began to tap against the new thatch. Ewan climbed into the loft and ran his hand across the underside. Not a single seep.
It was only a drizzle, Ewan. A proper rain will find its way.
The loft hasn't felt a drop. The salt seal is working.
Before she could answer, George's ladder clattered against the wall outside.
I told you I'd be back after the first rain. Let's see if your beachweed held.
If he finds a gap, the whole village will hear about it.
Too loose. The snow will pry these strands apart and dump right into your bed.
Ewan folded his arms at the foot of the ladder, but the loft above still held its dry warmth. George yanked a strand until it creaked, then let it snap back with a grunt.
It's tough, I'll grant you, but winter snow doesn't care about tough. It'll press until this whole weave gives way.
He shouldered his ladder and stalked off, but his last threat hung in the cold air.
Ewan, come up here. The smell. It's almost gone. I was sure it would rot by now, but it smells like a dry beach after a week of sun.
The salt pulls moisture out of the air and locks the fibers. It doesn't rot. It cures like fish on a rack.
But what if it only holds for a few nights? I can't stand the thought of waking in a puddle.
Outside the window, George's voice carried. He'd be back after the first real storm, and then the whole valley would see.
He's so certain. But this roof hasn't failed yet. Maybe Ewan isn't as mad as they say.
She said nothing more to Ewan, but her hand lingered on the salty weave as if it might yield a secret. That night, The freezing rain began, a hard slant that found every crack in the village's milled boards.
Sheds like a gull's back, not a drop inside.
Ewan, feel this. The loft isn't just dry, it's warm, like we kept a fire in the eaves.
The seaweed traps heat in pockets, like a thick cloak. The cold stays out, the warmth stays in.
In George Creswell's own house, a dark stain spread across the ceiling, and water dripped onto his woodworking bench.
Green lumber. That's why it leaks. Nothing to do with the storm.
No buckets under the bed, no dripping on the quilt. It's quiet.
At the public well next morning, a farmer complained that his roof had dripped all night. No one mentioned the McAllister cottage, and Ewan did not boast. That evening, Margaret climbed the ladder herself and traced the dry weave with a different kind of hope. The men gathered in the hall. A farmer whose roof had dripped all night spoke first. He admitted his ceiling leaked, but he heard the McAllister loft stayed dry as bone.
One rainstorm means nothing. Wet rot creeps up on you, and when it hits, the whole roof goes.
He threw a rotted plank onto the table. The stench lifted into the crowd.
This was sound oak 3 winters ago. Now look at it. Seaweed will rot faster.
Salt-cured seaweed doesn't rot. It cures like fish on a rack.
A few nods went through the room, but George's plank had planted deeper dread.
Wait for the snow load. Then you'll see that weed sag and pour winter through your ceiling.
I need proof older than my own roof. Something the village can't dismiss.
Ewan slipped out into the cold, a half-remembered name flickering in his mind.
Orm's Cot, the old ruin on the shore. Grandfather said it had stood since the Sea Kings.
He found the tumbled stones of Orm's cot half swallowed by sand, a plank of driftwood caught in the rack.
The same cross-layer pattern. Someone built like this long before me.
He carried it home under his coat, the wood heavier than any plank he'd ever hauled. In the attic, Margaret's candle found a leather-bound journal behind a loose rafter, its pages brittle with age. She opened to a drawing of a seaweed-thatched cottage, the same symbols scratched in the margin.
Ewan, look, a drawing of a thatched cottage and symbols just like the ones you carved on the roof.
She placed the driftwood beside the page, and the marks were twin-born.
This is proof. The old coasters used seaweed thatch. The village forgot, but the sea remembers.
In that quiet kitchen, they held a truth that would outlast every plank George ever sawed. The sky above the valley did not darken. It died, turning the color of cold iron. A rider on a lathered horse reined in at the crossroads, shouting a warning before his feet touched ground. A blizzard like none in living memory, the worst, the old men recall, is sweeping over the mountain. The village erupted. Men dragged ladders, women hauled spare boards, and every roof became a frantic battleground.
A shilling says that seaweed roof is the first to cave.
The wager ran through the village like a spark through dry grass.
Ewan, I can't lose you to this roof. Let's go to the hall.
I've trusted this weed. If I run now, the village will never trust anything I stand for again.
Even the old coasters didn't face a storm like this. Please, Ewan.
He looked at his wife, then at the dark sky, and felt the weight of a choice he could not dodge much longer. Ewan turned from the sky and took the hammer from its peg.
If this roof was good enough for Orm's cot, it's good enough for us.
Ewan, I'd rather freeze with you than bury you alone. I am staying.
Then help me seal the door. We do this together.
Ewan drove wooden pegs through the binding. His hammer strikes sharp and final against the rising wind. Outside, the first gust slammed the cottage door with the force of a falling beam.
No turning back now.
He pulled the driftwood and journal into the loft, tucking them between the blankets like a promise. Margaret climbed the ladder after him, her fear still raw, but her place now firmly beside him. As the wind began to howl, they sat together beneath the dark weave, listening for the first crack of timber. The blizzard hit the valley, not like weather, but like a wave, hard and full, shaking the cottage to its stone footings.
Ewan, the beams are groaning. Can the seaweed hold?
It's holding now. That's all that matters.
He crawled the length of the loft, feeling for cold drafts, but the salt-cured weave met his fingers like a shield.
Orms caught weathered 100 storms. This one won't be the last.
Outside, thick sheets of snow slid from the roof, with a long, low hiss, shedding weight before it could settle. Through the gale, a far scream rose from the village hall. A woman's cry, then a man's shout. The words were lost, but the panic carried, something about a roof giving way. The cottage shook again, but the seaweed roof only creaked, absorbing the blow and settling back into place.
They'll see. When the morning comes, they'll all see.
In a lull between the screaming gusts, Margaret pulled the journal from beneath the blankets and opened it to the drawing.
Ewan, listen. They laid the seagrass in crossed bundles, thick as a man's arm, and the snow never held.
Her voice trembled on the old words, but the meaning steadied the air between them.
That's the cross layering. It's the same. It's not my invention. It's a craft older than this valley.
He lifted the driftwood and laid it beside the sketch, the carved mark lining up with a 1 scratched in the margin.
This symbol, it's a builder's mark. Someone signed his work, knowing it would last.
The coasters knew this valley once. They left their craft in the stones and the wood.
A thunderous gust shook the cottage, but they did not flinch. In the shaking dark, they held the proof that they were not mad. The wind returned with a tearing shriek, and a cold finger of air traced Ewan's neck. A seam had split open near the chimney.
There's a gap. Snow's forcing through. If I don't seal it, the whole weave will unravel before morning.
No, Ewan, please. You can't go out there. That wind will tear you off the roof.
Ewan took the rope from its peg, knotted it around his waist with frozen fingers, and faced the door.
I won't let you. I'd rather lose the roof than watch you die in the snow.
I'd rather die than see it fail now. Hold the rope tight.
He drove his shoulder into the door. The storm answered with a howl, and the room filled with blinding white. Margaret clutched the journal to her chest, tears freezing on her cheeks, her prayer a thin sound in the chaos. The rope snapped taut against the doorframe, then slackened as Ewan climbed into the maelstrom above. In the shuddering dark, she pressed her lips to the journal's leather and whispered the old coaster's words, over and over. On hands and knees, Ewan crawled across the roof, the rope biting his waist and the wind flaying his skin.
Found it. The split's right here. Push the weed in. Don't stop.
He pounded a wooden peg with the heel of his palm, each strike a dull thud, lost in the storm.
That's it. Tighter than a drum now.
A monstrous slab of snow calved off the ridge and roared down the thatch as he dove for the ladder. The rope went rigid, then slack. Margaret screamed his name into the gale. Then he tumbled through the door, half frozen, his hands bleeding, and collapsed against her.
It's done. The roof holds.
Then it's enough. You are alive. That's all I needed.
They huddled on the floor, the seaweed ceiling dark and solid above them, while the storm raged on. As the storm's voice cracked toward dawn, Ewan's sleep was shattered by a sound deeper than thunder. The crash had come from George Creswell's house, where a beam split and the roof caved in.
No, my roof, my home.
Snow poured through the wound, burying his bedroom in a frozen avalanche. George dove under his workbench, the only cover left, as the house groaned around him. When the roar ceased, he crawled free through the litter of broken timber and shattered tools.
My home, my tools, everything I trusted, gone.
Stumbling into the killing cold, he aimed himself toward the distant glow of the village hall. In the McAllister cottage, Ewan woke to silence. The storm had passed, and the seaweed roof was still there. He touched the dry thatch above and listened to the world holding its breath. Ewan opened the door onto a world erased. The snow lay as high as a man's chest, and the silence was bottomless.
The valley looks like a graveyard. Not a single roof undamaged, but ours.
Where other roofs had buckled and split, the seaweed thatch had shrugged off the weight, its salt-cured weave still firm. Margaret stepped out behind him, the leather journal held against her chest like a shield. A farmer emerging from the hall stopped and stared, his voice a cracked whisper. God above, McAllister's roof is whole.
I told them it would hold, and now they see it. But the old builders deserve the credit, not me.
The murmur spread as more villagers gathered, their eyes tracing the untouched thatch as if recognizing a shape they had once known.
It isn't my stubbornness that saved us. It's an old craft the sea taught men long before any mill in this valley.
Margaret lifted the journal, open to the sketch, but did not speak. The drawing alone was a testament. In that frozen yard, the proof was no longer a secret. It was a roof over their heads. George emerged from the shell of his house, a shattered roof peg clutched in his fist. His leather apron gone, he crossed the yard toward the crowd, the snow soaking his trousers, his face a mask of defeat.
Ewan McAllister, I wagered a shilling your roof would be the first to cave. I never thought I'd lose.
He stopped before Ewan and, before the whole village, dropped to one knee in the snow.
Teach me the weave. My timber is splinters. My pride is dead.
It's not my weave to give, George. It belongs to the men who built this valley before either of us drew breath.
He took George's arm and raised him to his feet, then pointed toward Margaret and the journal. Margaret stepped forward, the journal open, but the words were not needed yet. George's eyes fell on the driftwood, and the journal, and a different light replaced the shame. For the first time in 30 years, George Creswell lowered his head, not in surrender, but to learn. Margaret opened the journal to the last page, where a Latin inscription sat beneath the sketch of a coastal cottage.
Built by sea fathers, the grass never rots, it only grows stronger.
An old woman pushed through the crowd, her eyes fixed on the journal as if she recognized a ghost. Her gnarled finger touched the sketch, and she whispered that her grandmother had spoken of such roofs. No one in the valley had believed her. But here was the proof laid bare in salt and ink. A murmur spread outward, and the forgotten craft re-entered the world in a dozen hushed voices.
It was never mine. It belonged to the sea and the old hands that built Orm's cot.
Margaret looked from the journal to the roof, and the connection was no longer a question. In that yard, surrounded by ruined timber and snow, the village simply remembered what it had forgotten. Ewan climbed a borrowed ladder and began the lesson, his hands moving through the cross-layering, as if they had known it for centuries.
Like this. Cross them tight and peg them deep. The salt does the rest.
Will you let me try? I owe that roof a debt.
Ewan climbed down and placed a thick strand in George's calloused hands.
We'll rebuild your house first, George. Every roof in this valley will outlast us both.
By midday, a dozen men were stripping shattered planks, their eyes turning to the beach where the tide had left fresh weed. Margaret sat on the cottage step, the journal in her lap, and watched the first new roof rise under her husband's guidance. George's hands, clumsy with cold, fumbled the first few ties, but Ewan guided them until the peg drove true. By evening, a new roof had begun to take shape, not of milled board, but of salt grass and ancient pattern.
They called it rotting beach trash, but it holds longer than any sawn wood. And now, it holds us together.
Months later, spring warmth thawed the valley, and half the roofs were now dark with seaweed. Ewan walked the shore, his cart empty for the first time, but not alone. A dozen villagers followed, filling their own carts with the weed they once ridiculed.
Hard to believe we ever called this rotting beach trash.
The sea gives what it gives. We were just too blind to take it.
Ewan stooped and lifted the same driftwood marker from the sand, its ancient symbol still sharp against the gray wood. He handed it to George without a word, and the carpenter traced the mark with a new reverence.
30 years I sawed timber, and not once did I think to look at the shore.
The old coaster's mark. It's on every roof now. You'll never lose it again.
And above them, on 100 cottage roofs, the dark seaweed lay thick and dry under the spring sun. On the cottage step, Margaret watched Ewan teach a village boy the weave, the old journal open in her lap. An old woman sat beside her and murmured, "My grandmother would have wept to see this." She traced the driftwood symbol on the cover and closed the journal for the final time.
And now, it will never be forgotten again.
Far up the coast, on a sea cliff wrapped in fog, The cottage from the journal still stood. Its roof was thick with dark, salt-crusted seaweed, the same cross layer binding the rafters. A wave shattered below, and the thatch did not move. The builder's mark was still visible on the lintel, cut by a hand that knew the grass would never rot. And along the coast, the forgotten craft was simply remembered. The sea gave what it gave, and now the valley would never lose it again. Ewan McAllister never built a mill or earned a shilling from his roofs, but when the next great snow came, the valley that once called him mad slept warm. Every cottage roof was dark with seaweed, and not a single plank of George's timber was needed. The seaweed held fast, shedding the weight as the old coasters knew it would. No rot, no sag, just salt and strength woven into every strand. George, now the steadiest thatcher in the valley, never touched a saw again. He told the children that the sea taught men long before any mill was built, and along the coast, the forgotten craft was simply remembered. The old cottage on the cliff still stands, its roof unchanged after centuries. The sea gave what it gave, and the grass never rots.